There's a single fund in the world that controls immeasurable amounts of wealth, shares in 9,000 international companies, real estate in top destinations, and stakes in countries and companies it continues to accrue interest on. Even scarier, this fund is under the control of a single nation. Is it China? Is it the US? What if we told you it was a country of 5.5 million people and lots of snow? That's right, we're talking about Norway. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're going to explore how this small Scandinavian country controls the world and flies under the radar while doing so. Norway is widely known as being one of the most prosperous, democratic, and happy places on Earth, with a great quality of life for its citizens to boot. How did it get that way, and how does it enable it to control the world? In the mid-1900s, Norway was thriving, enjoying stability and a strong economy, something it had maintained for nearly 150 years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, with one small exception during World War II. At the time, Norway had a healthy timber and fishing industry, combined with rapid industrialization that started in the late 19th century. But something happened in 1969 that would change the course of the country forever. Petroleum companies around the world thought that there might be valuable resources lurking in the Norwegian continental shelf, more specifically oil. Esso did find some oil at a site called Balder in 1967, but the deposit wasn't economically viable. Then in 1969, while exploring another section of the shelf, Phillips Petroleum got an early Christmas gift: oil. And not just any oil. The discovery of Ekofisk turned out to be one of the largest offshore oil fields ever found. By June 15, 1971, drilling was underway. But how much would this actually benefit Norway? Wouldn't Phillips just walk away with most of the profits? Not so fast. Before granting any drilling permits, Norway's head of state, Einar Gerhardsen, made a brilliant move. In May 1963, he declared that the Norwegian government had sovereignty over the Norwegian continental shelf. That meant that any natural resources found there belonged to the state, not to foreign corporations. Clearly, the Norwegian people agreed with his decisions, as he was elected prime minister of the country a total of 4 separate times, the longest-serving non-monarch leader in Norway's history. Foreign companies still had plenty of incentive to invest and develop the oil fields. They would still take home about half of the profits from Norway's massive oil supply, just not all of it. To keep control of its resources, Norway established a national energy company called Statoil, now known as Equinor. The government still holds a 67% majority stake in the company, ensuring that Norway, not foreign corporations, manage its vast oil reserves and other energy sources like hydrocarbons. Norway leveraged Statoil to secure 50% state participation in every single production license granted to petroleum companies. Why should Esso and BP executives be the only ones profiting from Norway's resources? The Norwegian government made sure that if oil was being drilled, it wouldn't just make foreign corporations rich, it would enrich Norway itself, and by extension, the Norwegian people. And that brings us to Norway's current status as a quiet powerhouse, a secret controller and investor in much of the world. Though Equinor has undergone changes like partial privatization and the government directly investing in oil field development in exchange for a share of the profits, one thing remains constant: oil still makes Norway an insane amount of money. How much, you ask? As of December 2024, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund was standing at around 20 trillion kroner, or $1.8 trillion. For a country of 5.5 million people, the US, for example, made about $244 billion from oil in 2023. But the US also has 61 times the population of Norway. The Norwegian government then made once again a very smart decision. They did not want to be subject to the unstable highs and lows that, depending on a one-resource industry like oil, can create in an economy. They also didn't want to fall prey to the resource curse, an issue that affects many countries in which precious metals and resources are discovered. The resource curse is the tendency of resource-rich nations to fall into political instability, economic inequality, corruption, or outright poverty. This happens when profits create an oligarchy, confining the wealth to the elite, when government corruption erodes democracy and leads to authoritarian rule, or when foreign exploitation drains the country's resources for outside benefit. And sometimes nations hit the worst-case scenario, suffering from all three at once. But Norway had something going for it, something it was going to exploit to take control of companies throughout the world. It was already a pretty rich country, and more than that, it already had a very strong democracy in place. So the state developed smart ways to smooth the economic highs and lows of oil while making Norway one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The Government Pension Fund. It may sound like a bureaucratic organization that gives senior citizens their retirement checks, but it's actually one of the wealthiest and simultaneously most intelligently run operations the world has ever known. The Government Pension Fund is split into 2 entities, Government Pension Fund Global, and Government Pension Fund Norway. The latter concerns itself mostly with domestic investments in big Norwegian companies and functions a bit like a national insurance fund. But the Government Pension Fund Global, otherwise known as GPFG, that's where Norway holds the real power, because it is the single largest investor in the world. Though the fund rarely has a majority stake in companies, it holds at least a small stake in today's most important international corporations, at least 9,000 of them. The fund is operated by the central bank, Norges Bank. The Ministry of Finance creates its investment strategy, while the Norwegian Parliament has created a framework for investments and studies potential changes to the framework. But at the end of the day, the fund is owned by the people of Norway, and those people are sitting on a gold mine, or rather an oil mine. The GPFG is so massive, it now holds around 1.5% of all shares in international companies. But it's not just about stocks. While 70% of the fund's value is invested in global equities, 25% is in bonds, with the rest spread across real estate and energy infrastructure. Some of its biggest holdings include Microsoft at $41 billion, Apple at $35 billion, and Nvidia at $34 billion. But that's just the beginning. The fund also has significant stakes in Eli Lilly and Company, JP Morgan Chase, ExxonMobil, Alphabet, Google's parent company, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, just to name a few. Not only that, but the fund has been performing better than ever. Due to strategic investments and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which sent gas prices soaring, it doubled in value from 2019 to 2024. Norway's sovereign wealth fund now generates an annual return of around 6.3%, making it better at investments than most Wall Street hedge funds, which averaged an annual return of 5% during the 2010s. Right now, the value of Norway's sovereign wealth fund translates to $321,000 for every person, including children living in Norway. Norway isn't just a passive investor either, sitting back like some 90-year-old former CEO on a yacht and watching its stocks rise in value. It prides itself on taking a very active part in investor meetings, votes, and encouraging the shaping of corporate policy. According to Tufts University, it's considered to be one of the world's most transparent sovereign wealth funds and with the best corporate governance. And the GPFG ensures that its principles are upheld by voting in accordance with them on shareholder boards. So why isn't Norway's sovereign wealth fund making headlines like, for example, Kuwait's or Saudi Arabia's? After all, it dwarfs these other, more highly covered funds like Qatar's, worth $526 billion, and even China's, worth only $1.35 trillion compared to Norway's $1.8 trillion. Well, one reason may be that Norway's investments are more transparent. The fund publishes information on its portfolio value, the companies it has investments in, the percent of capital and voting rights it has in any particular company, and therefore it doesn't have mysterious, opaque, sometimes questionable natures that other sovereign wealth funds are known for, meaning it attracts less speculation and media frenzy, despite its massive influence. Another reason is trust. Unlike other sovereign wealth funds that might raise eyebrows, Norway's fund is seen as activist for the right reasons. The GPFG is run by a board that constantly reviews investments to make sure they're not running afoul of their own ethical guidelines regarding sustainability and human rights. Though, as seen with big corporate stock investments already mentioned, this guideline doesn't lead to perfectly ethical investing. Investing in massive corporations in general makes that exceedingly hard. It does make Norway more discerning than most with its money. For example, the fund's board decided in 2010 that 17 tobacco companies would be excluded from potential investments due to their incredibly negative and obvious effects on public health, i.e., they sell death sticks and it's not cool. Rio Tinto was excluded in 2008 after several concerning incidents in its past, including the dumping of 1 billion tons of mine waste into rivers in Papua New Guinea. The result was fully contaminated water and land, something the locals definitely did not ask for. Walmart was excluded in 2006 for systematically violating human rights, something many shoppers who have seen the pain behind the eyes of the average Walmart greeter always assumed to be the case. Things like breaking international laws regarding child labor, health and safety, blocking unionization, and underpaying women didn't help Walmart's case for being an ethically responsible company either. Companies like Lockheed Martin are also off the list for producing nuclear weapons, as is Boeing for producing nuclear weapons. Some of these companies like Walmart and Rio Tinto were reinstated a decade later after supposedly changing their working conditions and getting reassessed by the fund. The Norwegian fund believes that by sticking to its guidelines, it can also encourage better corporate governance, transparency, and more ethical practices overall in the companies hoping for its investments. And the fund is active. According to 2024 records, GPFG voted at over 11,000 shareholder meetings, voting at a rate of 97%. In addition to showing up at the general shareholder meetings, the fund also arranged separately 3,300 meetings with companies that they were invested in to chat about things they were concerned about or wanted to change. This included issues like board members having industry expertise, unfortunately not a given in today's corporate world, being independent from CEOs, and respecting the environment and human rights. Given that it's still invested in Exxon, it doesn't seem like the GPFG always gets what it wants, but if it tries sometimes, it can get executive boards to take its concerns seriously. However, the GPFG is also pretty proactive. The fund publishes position papers that clarify how it'll vote in the future, sending a clear message to the corporations it's invested in that this is what we will and will not support. Act accordingly. And once again, the general public doesn't pay much attention because Norway's fund tends to take positions that align with common sense. For example, one paper from the fund argued that CEOs shouldn't receive bonuses based on short-term, artificially inflated performance. Instead, their rewards should be tied to long-term value creation and sustainable growth. That's a stance most people can easily get behind. Norway also holds outsized influence in other areas, mostly, once again, tracing back to its booming energy industry. Particularly after the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Norway is the largest exporter of energy to Europe. However, it's considering restricting the amount of exports to the EU. Of course, the fact that Norway's profits soar because of increased oil demand following increased international conflict is a bit of a touchy subject. Some have accused the country of being a war profiteer, though Norway vehemently denies that accusation. And to be fair, it can't do much about the fact that instability in the world tends to raise oil prices. Worldwide, Norway also ranks fourth in exports of natural gas. As tensions between the West and Russia, particularly the European Union and Russia, continue to rise, the continent's dependence on Norway is likely to increase. In addition, the country's shipping fleet is ranked fourth by value internationally. But speaking of conflicts, Norway also exerts its influence through its fund to punish nations it deems as breaking international law. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the Norwegian Prime Minister announced that the country's sovereign wealth fund would sell off its Russian assets. Before the war, the fund had shares in 47 Russian companies and government bonds, adding up to a value of $2.8 billion in 2021. The GPFG was one of the largest stakeholders in Sberbank, a major Russian financial institution, as well as energy giants Gazprom and Lukoil. Pulling out of those Russian assets contributed to Russia's stock market plunging and the weakening of its economy. Strangely enough, Norway's also using its fund to undermine the very industry that it feeds, oil. One of Norway's goals for the future is to reduce emissions and encourage the implementation of green energy. Norway has taken the stance that climate change now poses a substantial financial risk, in addition to the environmental challenges scientists describe, and it must be dealt with in some way. Though this would undermine one of Norway's premier industries, that's part of the reason why the fund was developed in the first place. So profits from oil and gas can be captured and invested into the country's future, without Norway always needing to rely on oil to stay afloat. The transition has been gradual but steady. In 2016, the GPFG appealed to Parliament to be allowed to exclude companies focused on coal production from its investments. In 2017, the fund said it would be removing around $35 billion of oil and gas stocks from its holdings. This had double the benefit for the fund, as Norway didn't want to be vulnerable to the rapidly fluctuating oil and gas prices, as well as potential permanent drops in price. In 2018, the fund added companies with substantial revenue from coal-fired power production to its list of exclusions. The next year, the GPFG said that companies that only explore and produce oil and gas had to go as well. Now, you may notice that despite all of this, the fund is still heavily invested in Exxon, a company best known for replacing Alaskan seawater with 11 million gallons of oil in 1989. In fact, the fund has drawn criticisms from many for remaining invested in companies that overall impact the environment negatively. However, others argue that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is trying to change things from within, as was shown in 2023 with its votes in ExxonMobil and Chevron meetings. GPFG voted against management proposals to re-elect the company's CEO as chairman of the board, adhering to its belief that those two roles should be split. The goal was to prevent one person from holding too much power and influence. And in relation to climate goals, the fund supported shareholder proposals that required Chevron and ExxonMobil to set medium-term Scope 3 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. It argues that the US-based energy companies have lagged behind their European counterparts like BP and Shell in setting specific targets for emission reduction. Perhaps that's why the fund's equity investments are tilted toward European companies in general. Tufts University studied the fund closely in 2014 and found that the GPFG is a European fund for Europe. The fund has taken a deliberate decision to give preference to investments in European countries and to penalize stakes in North American, especially US companies. It also is possible that European companies are simply more likely to align with the GPFG's guidelines for acceptable corporate behavior. They're often eager to attract investments from the fund. At the same time, they must adhere to the European Union regulations, which already enforce stricter corporate governance and ethical standards. That might signal to companies throughout the world that if they want to attract the attention of the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, their governance should fall in line with the GPFG's guidelines. This way, Norway's fund exercises a form of soft power. In addition, the fund's insane wealth and great return on investment also serve as an example that investment that's guided by some base level of ethics and sustainability can still be incredibly profitable. Remember those bonds we talked about earlier? Well, a full 7.5% of the Norwegian GPFG fund is invested in US government bonds, the largest holding the fund has in any bonds, translating to $136 billion. This may sound irrelevant, but Norway's holdings of government bonds could make countries around the world take its message more seriously. Because the CEO of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, Nicolai Tangen, has been increasingly alarmed about rising national debt levels and has warned countries that they are not doing enough to bring them down, if the GPFG threatens a bond sell-off, this might pressure some countries to do more. In the meantime, Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund shows no signs of slowing down on its returns or losing any power. Smart investments have concentrated the GPFG's equity investments in high-performing tech stocks, which led to an 18% return on equity in 2024. Overall, the fund actually gained $95.5 billion in value in just 2024. The value of just its one-year return places it in the top 10 pension funds within the US, and there's just under $2 trillion sitting within the fund besides that. So Norway's sovereign wealth fund's sway over corporations and governments worldwide seems like it'll only increase. What that means for business and how much it'll actually affect the course of the world remains to be seen. Did you know that Norway was sitting on this huge heap of wealth? Let us know what surprised you most in the comments below. In the meantime, check out Why is Monaco So Rich? Or click on this video instead.